our final session for this first day. It might be the final session, but we still have three very powerful speakers. Okay, so our final session for this first day is a forum entitled Long Live Literature. We have three esteemed speakers presenting on three different aspects of literature. We have Dr. Masaki Edwin Betamani, Emeritus Professor at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia, who will be speaking on literature and lifelong enjoyment of reading. Emeritus Professor Dr. Masaki Edwin Betamani is a poet, writer, editor, critic, bibliographer, and academic, and was given the Asian Education Leadership Award conferred by the World Education Congress, Mumbai, India, and the Malaysian English Language Teaching Association Special Award. Next, we will have Mr. Anthony Partington, the principal of GEMS International School, Tropicana Metro Park, who will be presenting on the living text. Mr. Anthony believes in a complete education, striving for academic excellence and great examination results, whilst providing the experiences and building the character skills that students need to succeed in learning and life. We will also once again be listening to Mr. Masaki Morisawa, the Senior Product Manager of Gale Asia, speaking on literature research and life skills. Mr. Masaki worked for antiquarian and academic bookseller in Japan previously. He also studied English literature in Sophia University, Tokyo. So this forum will also be moderated by Dr. Chitra Krishnan, IDOD, the Vice President of Education Welfare and Research Foundation Malaysia. In her professional career, Dr. Chitra's academic qualifications mirror her interest in education and the overwhelming opportunity of working with different groups of children and adults. So I'm handing over the floor to all four of you for our final session for this first day. Over to you all.
Literature and lifelong enjoyment of reading. How often do we see someone reading a book these days? Is it more common to see someone with a phone or an iPad? And what are they doing with this iPad or phone? They're certainly reading. They're reading from a screen. We don't often see people reading books these days. And for me, when I talk about books, I am talking about literature. And in schools today, we have students reading books, of course. They read books largely for information. It's not often that they get to read literature or literary texts, except maybe in the language classroom, the Malay language classroom, or the English language classroom. And even as they read these books, are they reading for information? Are they developing skills? Or is it for literary purposes? Now, what I'd like to do today is talk about how literature can provide enjoyment. Often when teachers talk about literature, it is related to exams. Very often students are told that we are going to study a poem or a short story, and this is in relation to the exam. And therefore, this idea of pleasure or enjoyment is often not linked with reading literary texts. What I like to propose in this talk is that we nurture our learners to enjoy literature. And what do we mean, or what do I mean by literature? When I say literature, I'm referring to either reading short stories, novels, poetry, or even drama. Now, in order for our students to be able to read any of these things, we need to nurture them. That is a key word, nurturing our learners to become readers. Now, very often, reading takes place in the classroom and it is teacher-led. Again, what kind of role models do teachers play when it comes to reading literature? Have your students seen you reading a novel or carrying a novel when they visit you in the staff room? Have you told them what is your favorite poem or who might be your favorite writer. What I think we should do is to bear in mind that our students look to us and they see us. And if we promote reading and we show to them that we enjoy literature and that they too should develop this love for reading and this love for literature, why do we want our students to read literature? I believe we want them to read literature because literary texts are about lives. Whether they read Malaysian writers or international writers, what is important is that they read and that they're reading about life. And we want them to connect with what they are reading. So it is also very important that we aid our students when it comes to reading literature. Today, we have literature which is available to all ages of readers. It is important that we are aware that there is children's literature for our young learners in the primary school. There are young adult literature and literary texts which can be used for our secondary school students. And of course, then there will be literature that is meant for adults. Now, what is important is for us to connect our readers to the right kind of literary materials. Do not expect Malaysian secondary school students to take a liking for Shakespeare. Shakespeare is very much for the mature and adult reader, for the very proficient and competent reader. Most of our learners are beginning as readers, and therefore we should give them books that they can understand, that they can relate to. Children's literature is targeted for children, the way it is written, the format, and the layout. Young adult literature is again targeted at adolescents. Now, it is important that we give them the opportunity to read about characters and issues which they can connect with, which are young adult issues, where they can see themselves in the books that they are reading. If we want them to enjoy literature, it is important that we give them the right kind of reading material. They need not read adult literature at this point. They can come to it at a later stage. Now, for our learners, then, teachers should be there to help them find out what is available to them. There are a lot of young adult literary texts available today. Now, we don't have to always look at the international or American or British texts. Even in Malaysia, we have young adult literary texts that are available. For example, Hannah Altaf's book about the May 13th incident is a very relevant book for our young readers. There are collections of young adult writing by Malaysians who our students might be able to connect with because they are familiar with the context, they're familiar with the issues. So I think it's very important that as teachers, we play an important role in cultivating our students' reading habit. It's important that the element of enjoyment is brought into their reading experience. Very often we talk about elitist literature, highbrow literature. I think it is important that we look at popular culture when we talk about enjoying literature. There are a lot of TV series which are tie ins with novels and stories that our students are familiar with. Very often, if they read a, or very often, if they watch a TV series, they could be motivated to to then read the novel or read the short stories. There are popular culture texts, for example, the Harry Potter series and the movie tie-ins. Besides Harry Potter, there are other young adult texts which fall under popular culture. It might be necessary for us to introduce our students to popular culture texts before they go on to read literary fiction. Very often we emphasize on literary fiction, and some of our readers or some of our learners may not be ready for it. And therefore, I think it's important that we are sensitive to our students' needs, and as teachers, we should pay attention to what are some of their concerns, their issues, and we should then try to find titles that they would enjoy reading. Again, there will be issues of language ability, content. As teachers, then, we have to play the part. We have librarians in schools who can also support us in our attempts to make reading enjoyable. And once young people read, we hope that they will then go on to read in their adult life. We hope that it'll be something that they would want to do. There are many things that are open to them, like reading circles, reading groups. They can start among themselves and later go on to find other friends in their adult life. So I believe that the key, what is key or really important is nurturing readers to enjoy reading so that reading would become a lifelong experience. Thank you.
In our understanding and appreciation of literature, we are often influenced, I feel, by our earliest experiences. And my single biggest influence in the way that I approach literature and the teaching of it is in the teaching that I experienced in my A-level course. It was the first time that I'd been asked to consider what literature was, and I learned very quickly from my teacher that literature stems from an oral tradition. It's one of the oldest art forms that we have. Its endurance is because it provides us with the opportunity to live through the experiences of those who have gone before us in order that we can learn from those experiences and perhaps avoid some of the pitfalls. But texts are also ambiguous, and I feel that this is one of the most important aspects that we need to convey to young people when we are encouraging them to read literature, and when we hopefully are encouraging a lifelong enjoyment of literature. They're ambiguous, and into that ambiguity we can place ourselves, because the reader, the audience, is a fundamental part of literature in of itself. One of the concerns that I have about the way that literature is currently taught is that because of pressures from things like examinations, we're often stuck asking this question: what does it mean? And the truth is, there is no single answer to that. Now, for lots of teachers, that is a great benefit of literature. It's one of the things that children actually, though, really struggle with. And there are lots of textbooks and there are lots of teaching approaches that seem to want to cram students, because at the moment, one of the things that we're really privileged is that terminal examination, providing students with the right answer. The answer that's going to get them the best grades, the answer that's going to get them into the best universities or the best job prospects. And we aren't actually focused on what's the right answer for literature. If we look at the purposes of assessment, we can see that as well as summative assessment and formative assessment, we've got diagnostic assessment where we can analyse the strengths, the weaknesses, the knowledge, the skills. And it's a really important part of the study of literature, that it's not just about learning about those texts and the knowledge of those texts, but it's about the skills of analysis, the skills of discussion, the skills of consideration, of empathy, of being able to value one judgment or opinion against another. And those are really, really important for the softer skills that are needed in the modern workplace, and I believe in the future. In answering the question, why study Shakespeare, I'm going to go back again to my A-level classroom and to one of those really first experiences that I had with the approach to teaching Shakespeare and more widely literature that I have chosen to take myself, and also one which I think has been really quite popular over the years and really should be given a fresh airing, as it were. And I was exposed to texts which were edited by a gentleman called Rex Gibson. He was a teacher and an academic in Cambridge, England, some years back. And he was the editor of the School Shakespeare series. And in one of his most fundamental texts that he wrote, which is actually called Teaching Shakespeare, a handbook for teachers, he explains his reasons for teaching Shakespeare. And he says an easy answer to the question why teach Shakespeare is why not. After all, many teachers can give examples like the ones here of their students' intense engagement with the plays. It's a class of 11-year-olds who create a thrilling dance drama of the episode of Prospero relates in The Tempest, in which Sycorax and her potent ministers imprison Ariel in a cloven pine. Or the 13-year-olds who bring the market square of Verona to bustling life, into which the feud of the Montagues and Capulets then violently erupts. And it goes on and he gives more examples. But he really hones in on the cooperation that exists in such classrooms as students work together on their Shakespeare mirrors the creative experimental ethos of the theatrical rehearsal room, where individual talents unite in cooperative enterprise, and the self-evident commitments of such students and the satisfying sense of pleasure in the group and individual achievements are usually experienced directly only by those who share them. Now, there are a couple of things that I think are really important here. One, and it goes back to that oral tradition, is that the appreciation of literature is a collective experience. It's something that brings us together. And secondly, it's that opportunity to help shape their own meanings. And I think that is something that's been missed. There isn't a single meaning to many of these texts. In fact, the coming together of the reader and the author, or the audience and the author, and their joint meanings is what really makes text relevant. It's what means that they still mean something in context to us, and that's really important. Gibson expands on this and he says the more public response to the question of why to teach Shakespeare can be organised under 4 headings. Abiding and familiar concerns, the idea that texts are still relevant, they cover things that are still open for discussion, they help us rehearse those discussions. Number 2, student development. By working through some of these things together, we can actually help a child develop. In rehearsing a play or rehearsing a performance, we're almost rehearsing certain things for life. Language. We all know that the exposure to sophisticated, complicated language through reading is one of the things that advances our own vocabulary. I know that myself, and I see it especially when I am working with students for whom English is not their first language, that they're able to articulate things in a way that would not be possible through just language lessons. And removing literature from the study of English and just focusing on those language skills, I think is rather reductive and deprives an English language learner of these other vital aspects that literature brings to the study of a foreign language. And then this final one, which is really, really important, this idea of otherness. The idea that through literature, as Keats says, you can travel in realms that you would never have thought possible. You can have the experience of somebody who you will never be. That's a really important aspect, and I'm delighted today that I'm sharing a platform with Professor Masaki, and I think he has brought together some of these fundamental aspects that I'm talking about in terms of literature. Literature is a common heritage. It's something that brings us together. Literature is about performance. I attended one of Professor Malaki's readings at the Penang Literary Festival, and I was really taken by the joint and collaborative nature of the event and the enjoyment that we have together. That's why I've got his book, which I will recommend to people. But the other thing that this book has taught me is about my experience of Malaysia and about my my appreciation of the people, of their concerns, of their feelings, their understandings of certain things. That's a really important lesson for our children to learn. So Gibson, through his work, created what we call an active approach to Shakespeare, and I was particularly taken by that. And when I became a teacher, I was very happy to continue to use these texts that Gibson and others had edited sometime before I even went to school. However, in 2008, I was delighted to be asked to be part of the team who was revising these edited texts, and I worked on two. I worked on Much Ado About Nothing and Twelfth Night. And one of the things that we tried to do when we were putting this together, we tried to adopt the active Shakespeare approach, the approach of collaboration, the approach of getting the play on its feet. So much is lost when you are teaching Shakespeare as just text on the page. It's so much more than that. It's about feelings, it's about emotions, and getting students to understand the way that they would think, the way that they would feel, and perhaps even the way that they would act in relation to many of these things is halfway to getting to them to understand the potential meanings that literature provides for them. And I think that's a really important thing. So you will see that, half of this book is dedicated to those activities, and that's really what they are. Too often the study of literature is passive. It's something to be taught, whereas my feeling is it is absolutely something to be experienced. So these are some fundamental questions that I think that teachers need to grapple with, and these are some of the points that I would like teachers these questions to consider. How do we support students to enjoy text? And what I mean by that is, do we read the text with students? Do we model how we read text with students? I think that's really important. Model the enjoyment of reading a text. Secondly, are they involved? How do you scaffold that experience in the safety of your classroom so that when they go away, they're able to do that themselves in private? A second question, what opportunities can we provide to elicit personal responses? Do we ask, how do the texts make students think, feel and act? Do we provide activities that encourage these responses? These texts they're not the only texts that do. So when you are looking at texts and textbooks, do search out those that what I would say, bring a play onto its feet. And finally, what assessments should we use in the classroom? Do we always need to assess through writing? Just because terminal examinations privilege assessment through writing, that doesn't mean to say that we need to do that in our own classrooms. There are other opportunities to assess students' understanding, and actually the way that they think, the way that they feel, and the way that they would act based on text is actually quite difficult to assess through writing, which normally focuses on analysis of language. These are not skills that we should neglect, but let's get that balance in there. And there is still a really important criterion rather in examinations, which focuses on personal responses, on contextual readings. Let's make sure that we privilege that as well. And do we help students develop and share meanings so that they can incorporate these into writing? Talking, discussion, listening to other people, building on those experiences. There is a really, really valuable experience, a really valuable learning opportunity that students should do before they go into examinations. Again, I come back to that idea of performance. The classroom is a rehearsal. It's an opportunity to rehearse these skills. Let's make sure that students have the opportunity to do that. And fundamentally, it should be fun. Now, I know that's difficult when there are certain pressures, but we have an opportunity, and I think we have a duty to ensure that students have access to all that literature is able to provide. And that is a wealth of experience for those that have the privilege to be able to access it. And I think by making it an activity and an enjoyment, we're able to ensure that we do our students a great service.
When we spend time thinking about how we can't change the world, we forget that the power to change someone's life, especially our own, is always in our hands. To discover authoritative content that has the power to transform. From the library to the classroom, at home, and into the world. Research for everyone. Teaching for everyone. Learning for everyone. Gale, here for everyone.
Hello, I am Masaki Morisawa from the publisher Gale, and today I'm very happy to share with you some of my thoughts on how the study of literature offers students opportunities to hone important life skills and how we can help them achieve those goals. But first of all, why study literature at all? There are many ways to tackle this question, but I found a rather striking example in this particular blog post by a colored woman explaining what white privilege means to a friend. So, she mentions, in my freshman college tutorial, our small group of 4 to 5 was assigned to read Thoreau, Emerson, Malcolm X, Joseph Conrad, Dreiser, etc. When it was the week to discuss the autobiography of Malcolm X, one white boy boldly claimed he couldn't even get through it because he couldn't relate and didn't think he should be forced to read it. And she says, my whole life, I've had to read things that don't have anything to do with me or that I relate to. But I find a way anyway because that's what learning is about, trying to understand other people's perspectives. I think this is a very apt example in these rather polarized times on how literature allows us to transcend our own limited perspectives and allows us to see the world from other people's eyes. Empathy, in other words. But reading literature is different from, say, reading a blog post or a tweet or a news article. Like this article, introductory article from a literature course mentions, to read literature is to read slowly. It means rereading and pondering about the meaning of words and how and why they are written. And this is very, very different from the kind of tweet reading or blog reading or post reading that today's young people are accustomed to. A deep reading of literature involves analyses, where students need to consider various contextual elements such as plot, setting, style, layers of meanings from within the text, or information outside the text such as historical and social context. And to take it to the next level, students are often required to write a full-fledged analysis, or paper, in other words. Here, it really becomes crucial to demonstrate and strengthen their reading by quoting extensively from secondary literature, such as biographies, criticisms written by other people, works explaining the time period or context in which the work was written, etc., etc. And gathering this kind of secondary material can be a time-consuming process, as much of this material exists outside of the open web, scattered in various different publications in various time periods. And this is where publishers like Gale can help, as we have been known as a publisher of literary resources for many decades, and we have gathered all this information into an easy-to-use full-text database, such as Gale Literature Resource Center. So, take for example, Albert Camus' The Plague, La Peste. This is a 20th century classic novel, and it is interesting because this novel, written in the 1940s, has enjoyed a resurgence in recent years because of the ongoing COVID pandemic and its obvious parallels with the situation described in the work. But like all great literary works, it is a work that allows many different interpretations. So, I have logged into Gale Literature Resource Center, and I would like to show you what you can find about Camus' Plague in Gale Literature Resource Center. This is the Gale Literature Resource Center homepage. As you can see, there is a very simple search box. There are search paths by authors and works, and you can see some featured authors and featured works. It's a very uncluttered and simple experience, and it also works on mobile devices. I can do a search on Camus Plague and simply hit search. And I am taken to the search results page where I see a list of icons at the top showing the types of material available to me. You have literature criticism, we have biographies, topic and work overviews, reviews and news, primary sources and literary works, multimedia. And this is very, very helpful to the student because each of these resources have different purposes and they provide different contexts from different standpoints. So it's really important that the students understand intuitively how these types of works differ. And all of these are secondary sources about Camus' Plague. So, say if I was a student who has just read The Plague and I want to gain a better understanding of the work, but not too difficult language. The first place I might want to go would be the topic and work overviews page. And here you would see some rather student-oriented introductions to The Plague and other related works. So I can open this one, Overview The Plague. This is from our series Novels for Students, and it gives you a short introduction followed by a plot summary and some analyses of major characters. And reading this alone would help the student kind of understand some of the basic points about the work. Now, back to the results screen, I might get interested in the author, Albert Camus, and what other works he has written. Then I can go to the Biographies tab, and for instance, I can click on a biographical entry on Albert Camus, again from Gale publication, Nobel Prize laureates in literature. And this will be written by a university professor who specializes in this author's work. And you will see a very extensive bibliography, very well written, followed by a narrative biography, a critical biography rather, which kind of looks into Camus' life and also into his creative output as he lived. And this will really give them a historical and biographical context about this author and his important works. Now, if you really want to read more in-depth criticism, you can go into the main part of Literature Resource Center, which will be the literature criticism part. And you can view various criticism over the years. Literature is a very, very historical discipline. So it doesn't mean in literature, new is not necessarily better. So you can read important pieces of criticisms from the 1970s, for example. And this looks at Camus' work from a theistic point of view. Or you can read others, such as this one, looks at Camus' Plague and how it has been interpreted over the years in many different times. Or you can read other various analyses written by various other authors from various time periods, from various standpoints as well. Now, if this is a little bit too much, students can also click on what we call the topic finder. And this will give them a sort of a heat map of the keywords that appear in all of these materials. And they can, for example, click on Dr. Ryu, who is one of the, well, basically the main character of this novel. And by clicking on this, you would see related articles on the right-hand side. And you can find some things that are kind of unexpected, really. For example, this one, Culture in the New Iraq National Library and Archive. So this is not exactly a literary article, but it compares Albert Camus' main protagonist, Ryu, with this gentleman, Saad Eskander, who is the Director General of the Iraq National Library and Archive, because they are facing very similar situations of a guy trying to do his job under extraordinary circumstances, in this case, extraordinary political circumstances. So that's another different point of view that you can add when looking into the work. Or you can go and see more recent works under the reviews and news section. One that I found particularly interesting was this one, The Writer for Tormented Times. This was written in 2020, last year, during our ongoing pandemic. And it now analyzes Albert Camus' Plague and how it is relevant and how some of the parts or some of the points of view, such as Camus' kind of unconscious colonial point of view, have not aged very well in our times. So it's a really interesting way to look at the work. So back to my PowerPoint. In conclusion, while reading literature in itself is an important learning activity for students, they can gain an even deeper, multifaceted understanding of its meaning and cultural context by reading widely of secondary sources about the work in question. And library databases such as Gale's make discovering such relevant resources so much easier and its exploration so much more exciting. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Edwin, Anthony, and Masaki. That was definitely three very, very interesting presentations. And I would like now to invite Dr. Chitra to actually proceed with the next session of with our three presenters. Over to you, Dr. Chitra.
Thank you, Ida. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank Prof. Edwin, Anthony, and Masaki for the insightful sharing on literature and reading. I hope parents, teachers, and students realize how the skills learned during their literature lesson is linked to one's life, especially when it comes to overcoming challenges, making decisions, which students should use skills such as analysis, discussion, empathy. They need all this in their everyday life. And the love of reading is definitely important to keep one mentally alert, I feel, because I'm also very into reading. I hope to read as many books as I can. And finally, Masaki's presentation of the cataloged data is really mind-boggling. It's so easy to get the information that you need nowadays. It's just at the fingertips. All right, gentlemen, I have some questions for all of you. I'll start with Prof. Edwin. How can teachers make reading literary texts more enjoyable in the English language classroom?
Thank you. Firstly, I just want to say how nice it is to be in this panel session, to hear the different viewpoints of how we approach teaching literature or even reading literary texts. And I think teachers, especially in Malaysia, play a very key role in nurturing readers. And as I mentioned in my talk, nurturing is something that is ongoing. And I think what I would like to say is that, firstly, teachers need to be readers themselves. And if they don't read, it's going to be very difficult for them to actually promote reading. And one of the things I do like about language class, when language and literature classes are interrelated, is that a lot of activities get to be done in the classroom. I was a teacher before I became a teacher trainer and a writer. And therefore, the things that I've done in my classroom, my students often do not remember what I said, but they remember what they did. So I take well to what Anthony was saying regarding performance. Drama is different from theater. When you have activities in a classroom, I remember when my students were doing Animal Farm, we actually had role play activities. We created a courtroom. People took on roles of Napoleon and Snowball, and they did various activities. And these activities actually meant that they had to read the text many times to understand what's going on, for you to then provide meaning. If you are supporting Napoleon, why? What did he do that he needed to be supported? And I also created a kind of a real world for them, where you actually had the jury, you have reporters, you have audience. So the classroom comes alive in that literary text. And when we did with my matriculation students, I did D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers. So we had a kind of a psychiatric ward, a psychologist talking to Paul. And for a student to express what Paul was going through, he needs to firstly understand. And sometimes if he gets it wrong, that's an opportunity later for the teacher to say, did you think you got that wrong and why? Without being judgmental. And the students become center in the activities. There are no spectators. So I think that one of the ways of nurturing students to read is get them to experience the text, create their own meanings. And I'm a great advocate of using local literary texts. Not just because I'm a writer, but because I think they connect. I mentioned Hannah Alkaf's novel, The Weight of Our Sky, a young adult literary text which deals with one of the biggest scarring incidents in Malaysia, the May 13th incident, which we all try not to speak about. Here is a book that provides an opportunity. And also, there's this book by Sharifah Aisha and Tutu Dutta. It talks about the principal girl, again, giving female characters. Very often our students read about foreign fairy tales. All these are tales taken from Asia and Malaysia. So again, using local material is a good way of getting them into it. As a student in the missionary school in Form 4, I started my literature class with Shakespeare. But you can't do that now these days. That was in the 1970s. I would love to go and but there are other ways in which you can lead students into Shakespeare. For example, if they were reading, if you want them to read Macbeth, there are a lot of young I know at least 3 or 4 young adult fiction, which are rewriting of Shakespearean, plays. This could be a way of leading in. There are many ways in which we want to arrive at different texts. So for me, I think teachers need to be very actively readers themselves and have a keen interest. Go to class and say, hey, I love literature, I enjoy reading, I want you to share my experience. Don't go to class and say, oh God, we got to do an exam, so we got to read this bloody book. It doesn't work.
Yes, thank you, Prof. Yes, students remember what they did during the class, and some even memorize certain parts of the text, and repeat it when they are with their friends. And talking about Shakespeare, I think Romeo and Juliet would have been a very good choice because almost everyone knows Romeo and Juliet.
Well, for us, it was Julius Caesar. We were in an all-boys school. And so everybody could take a role in it.
All right. Okay. Based on this area also, to Anthony now, what are the activities that can bring a text to life in a class?
Well, I agree with Professor Edwin in what he said about a teacher has to really enjoy literature, because I've seen so many people who I'm pretty convinced don't, and students really pick up on that. So the other bit that I think is really important in a classroom, and we sort of just touched on it there at the end, which is this idea of not understanding. I think it's a really important thing for teachers to say, I don't know what this means, because it then gives children the opportunity to tell us what it means. So that's that modeling and practicing and that collaborative cooperation to get to meaning, which I think is important. But one thing that I think is really important in terms of an activity is to actually make children create their own texts. So for them to be creative, there used to be an element in the A-level course when I first started teaching it, which was called an introduction to literature, and teachers could basically do what they wanted for about 6 weeks to sort of just get students used to the study of literature and talking about literature. And I really do like sonnets. I've always liked sonnets. I wrote just like poems. And what I used to do is I just used to read a few sonnets with the students in the first lesson. And then I would say, right, your homework is to write a sonnet. No instructions. It's just like the Great British Bake Off or something like that, the technical challenge. And you have to go away and you have to work out how it works, and you have to work out the meter, and you have to work out, the rhyme scheme and all of those kind of things. They absolutely loved that. And what they came back with, not only was it a great icebreaker into the idea of literature, but they came back with brilliant sonnets, which we invariably entered for competitions. But they came back with this appreciation of how difficult it is to be a poet, the decisions that you have to make, the choices that you have to make about language and things like that, which I think is a really valuable experience. And it's another activity. I always say I love to see activity in classroom, not passivity, and that's important for me.
All right. Next one is connected to the activities. What are the texts do you like to teach to foster an enjoyment of literature, and why? Because in your talk you mentioned about Shakespeare.
I did mention Shakespeare, yes.
Yeah, and Professor Edwin has been talking about Harry Potter.
Not Shakespeare, yeah.
Current texts that children love. So what do you think is something that you would like to teach students?
Yes. So Professor Edwin also said something which I totally agree with, which is the mixture of popular culture and what we might call high culture or literature. And I think that there are a lot of young adult texts, or even what we might term children's fiction, which is a good way of getting people in there. But one of the things that I'm really keen on in the classroom, because sometimes we do have to deal with texts which have been set by examination boards and things like that, which are not in that realm of children's and young adult literature. They are actually works of literature, that heavy term. I really think that people shy away from, but they shouldn't, from three things. And it's partly because when teachers do like literature, they tend to like novels. And one of the things that I think they always shy away from teaching are plays, poetry, and short stories. And the funny thing is, I think for children, they are manageable, they are relevant, because quite often they are written now, people are producing these texts now. And when we also think about young people, and we're talking about practicing and things like that, we talk about the internet and the impact that has, and we have this kind of, all of us have a much shortened attention span. Now, compare the poem, which is manageable in a lesson that we can all talk about, has ambiguity that we can all feed into, compared to Dickens. And I have to say, I'm bored by Dickens and a 400-page text, in like 9-point font and all of that kind of thing. Whereas a poem is really manageable. It's performative. You've got lots of voices. It's easy to interpret. We can create different versions of it. So my big steer for lots of teachers is don't shy away from poems, plays, and short stories, because the key thing about a short story is it's a very different work of literature from a novel. They're constructed in very different ways. They're almost like every word is really important in a short story. They're really selective, and they're almost like prose poems. That's a very ugly expression, but it's there's a lot to be said about short stories, and people do shy away from them.
All right. Carrying on with this, my next question is to Masaki. Now, Prof. Edwin has talked about some books, and Anthony has also stated some books. Now, what if students are not sure which literary works to read, or if they're looking for an interesting work to read? Can your database help them?
Well, that's a great question. My first answer would be to ask your teacher, ask Professor Edwin or Mr. Partington. I'm sure they'll be more than happy to give you recommendations. But if you must, use our database, and I hope you do. There are many pathways. We have author searches where you can search not only by an author's name, but you can search by time periods, genres, literary movements, and birth dates. And you can kind of narrow it down from there. So you can find Malaysian authors from the 20th century and choose from that list to explore. Or we also have featured authors and works that kind of rotate on the homepage of the database. So those might be a great way to start. And I hope that might be a great way to start exploring things on our database.
Yeah, I just saw that you had presented something that was written last year. So your database is very current, because your next question is, if students are more interested in works that is contemporary, so they can also refer to your database for that, right?
Yes. Of course, Professor Edwin and Mr. Partington both mentioned this, and I'm not surprised that students would be more interested in contemporary works. And actually, Gale has been publishing a whole series of contemporary biographies called Contemporary Authors. And we also have a series called Contemporary Literary Criticism. So we have always emphasized contemporary works in our databases. So we have lots of coverage. For instance, one of the authors that is currently searched a lot is Angie Thomas, and she wrote a very provocative novel called The Hate You Give, which is related to the Black Lives Matter movement. And that's something that is very, very current and also very relevant to perhaps the student's point of view. And you can also find materials related to that in our database as well.
The database is very impressive. My only worry is that students will go into it, access the data, and many of them like to copy paste because it is so impressive. You can like cross-check, you can do wonders with it makes research and learning so much easier with such a database. My the next question is for Prof. Edwin. Do you think Malaysian parents and teachers are role models as teachers to young people? I'm very upset about this question, but I will ask it.
The thing about being role models is before the idea is that our children actually see us reading, and what do we read? And do we read together as a family, or do we read together as a class? Do we have, reading is sometimes seen as a solitary activity. It need not be the case. It can be collaborative, especially in the classroom. I remember once when, in the height of the Harry Potter, when in the height of its popularity, one of the magazines, family magazines interviewed me, and they said, do you think Harry Potter is good and that, should parents allow it? I said, here's an opportunity, because Harry Potter is actually, it cuts across generations in terms of readers. So you actually have grandparents, parents, children, everybody reading it. So I said, if there are some issues that may concern the parents, here's an opportunity. Sit together and talk about it, because you're all reading the same book. It doesn't happen very often, but this is one such situation. And, if you think there are some dark, demonic elements there, well, here's a chance for you to also be concerned. And, I think the parents need to be more involved. Malaysia, we do have our issues. Not all parents read in English. I'm not saying that we should all read in English. Reading can be done in any language that works for the family. Same thing in this, writing. Sometimes people, let's not just privilege English language, reading in the English language, but reading in a language that works for the family. So, but we have this generational issue in many families. For example, in my home, my parents read in Tamil, but I read in English. But I had older siblings with whom I could relate and speak to in English. So I think that situation goes on today, where parents may be proficient in the mother tongue, which could be Tamil, Malay, whichever, but English might be the language of currency because of school. So different kinds of reading might be taking place. So in this classroom or in schools, I think it's either Malay or English. If you come from a Chinese medium school, then Mandarin. But, if you want your students to read, you need to be readers yourself. And one of the things I remember I did when I was in schools, in Mara Junior Science College in 1979, we had an event called the Paperback Revolution, because I really wanted to bring reading into the school. But I also decided it won't be the responsibility of the English department. So we got teachers from the maths department, science, various departments actually sitting with the students and saying, hey, I actually enjoy reading this. And when students see that, especially when students see that my maths teacher is actually reading a novel or short stories, then you realize that it is not really an elitist thing. It is something that you do to enjoy reading. Yeah, so I think teachers can and should be. And I remember one of the teachers confessed that, I read Danielle Steele. And everyone went, oh, it's like romance. But I tell my students, if that's where you need to start, that's good. But let's move on to literary fiction if you can. I think we shouldn't be too uppity about what students read. At the end of the day, we want them to connect, read about life, enjoy reading, So, yeah, I think teachers and parents will be different kinds of role models, but and I know, like, when parents cannot themselves be role models, they often get other elders, family members to help out. So yeah, it has to be learned from somewhere. You don't pick it up. Otherwise, you're only going to be reading, certain blogs or Instagram poems. Nothing against Instagram poems, but there's more poetry than just reading Instagram work. Yeah, or reading. Some people only read what they have on Facebook. What did you read today? And these days you can check your screen time, how much time you spent on Facebook and how much you spend on real reading. Yes. Thank you.
Yes, Prof. I've got one question for you. What do you think of introducing abridged version of literary text to children?
I think it's a starting point. It's the starting point. There's a place for abridged text, simplified text, but let's not disable our learners by just keeping them there. If it's a bridge to another level of reading, yes. For example, people read Shakespeare stories before they read the plays. That's okay, But again, why do you want to have simplified text when you already have text which is catered for different levels of readers? So I think that there was a time when there was a stronger place for abridged text. Now, you can actually match your students or learners' reading age with the kind of different texts that have been published. So very often reading a bridge text of an adult text does not really help. I'd rather you give them children's book to read about that. That is more authentic. Yeah, so I'm not a big fan of a bridge text. So.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. It has been wonderful being with you all and listening to the talk. And I hope our viewers also had the same experience. And good evening. And I'll back to Ida, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.